How's everybody doing? Has it been a good day at the conference? Come on, get a little more energy. Bruno here is very nervous, so we have to make him feel right at home.
Super nervous.
I'm Ned Bellavance, and today's topic is module design best practices. And since I don't know anything, I brought on these two fine gentlemen who know a lot. So let's start with Bruno. Who are you? What do you do?
Hey everyone, I'm Bruno Schaatsbergen. I'm a developer advocate at HashiCorp, and I'm opinionated on modules. And, Drew and I actually met through the core contributor program a couple years ago. We used to work on the AWS provider together.
Still do a little bit.
I still do a little bit, yeah. And in the past, I used to be responsible for a large internal library of modules. And I like to talk about all my opinions. Yeah.
All right, excellent. And Drew, welcome.
Hey everybody, I'm Drew Mullen. I'm a principal architect at Riverpoint Technology. I think from a module design standpoint, if you've seen any of my work, it'd be through the AWS IA repos, which are a bunch of, when I was at Amazon, we published a bunch of different kinds of Terraform modules. And yeah, been in this ecosystem for a while.
Great. So let's start with the fundamentals. What do you take into consideration when you're getting started to create a module? Like, what do you need to know ahead of time before you write a single line of code? Bruno, what about you?
It's a good question. It's not so much coding, actually. It's talking. A lot of talking to the different stakeholders and the ones that are using the module eventually. I always like to think, looking at the broader perspective, as a platform engineer or a platform engineering team, I usually like to think of it as running a business. If you build modules without talking to your customers, they likely don't end up buying it. And if customers don't end up buying anything, you're doing the wrong thing. I think a common mistake that's made is that people start building Terraform modules without talking to their end users to really understand the use case.
Yeah.
So it's talking. Yeah.
Talking. OK. And same thing for you, Drew. Like, what sort of questions would you ask the stakeholders about the module?
Sure. So a big first question to ask is whether or not the module is going to be public or private.
Okay.
If you're going to be publishing something to the public, then you have a lot different type of scope that you might be trying to achieve. And I think scope is a big question that you're trying to answer. When Bruno was pointing out, like, you want to talk to your stakeholders, you want to understand, like, what scope is in and what is out. Because the more flexible your module is, sometimes the more complicated it is, and you might see less adoption. You know what I mean?
I see. So usability is a big factor in that.
Yeah.
And obviously, if it's a private module, you can talk directly to the people that are actually going to consume it. If it's going to be a public module, then you are serving a wider audience that you don't necessarily have the input from. Mm-hmm. So you've decided to make a module. You've gathered the requirements for it. One of the fundamental things you need in a module is inputs. What is your approach to what type of input variables should be there? What should have a default value ever? Do you do validation? Like, where do you start, Drew, with input variables?
I think that's the most crucial question to get at the beginning, is because your module, what you're presenting is an abstraction. And so the shape that your variables take is exactly the same the way that an API presents a shape. So that's the contract that you start to form with your users, right? So how are you going to organize your variables? And often it can be as simple as just a straight up Boolean or like a single variable. But also, like, you can structure your modules using like types and objects so that you can actually make inputs that, you know, kind of organize the module in interesting ways that your users might make it easier for them to actually start using.
So, controversial question possibly. What's your feeling on very complicated data structures for inputs versus a simple string or a Boolean?
I can start.
Yeah, go for it.
I'm personally not afraid of complicated module inputs. I think the key with that is that you have to provide good examples and good validation. So validators can be a really nice way that you can give someone feedback if they're missing, you know, the right type of argument that you're expecting within the object or something like that. Yeah.
And I quickly want to add to the default values. So I think an underrated practice for default values is using null. Many people think that null is nothing. Null is actually nothing. Null represents the absence of a value. And if you set the default value for null for an input argument for your module, Terraform actually omits it, and it's not passed down to the resource, which ends up that you fall back on a default value that's specified in the schema of the resource in the provider. And if that doesn't have a value, it actually falls back usually on an upstream default value in an API.
Oh, interesting. So if I could read that back to you, what I'm understanding is if I put a default value of, say, an empty string, that's different than setting it to null.
Very different.
Because the empty string would actually get passed as a value for that argument, whereas null is no value set, so whatever your default value is, use that.
Exactly, yeah. And I think any line of code that you write, it's a line that you have to maintain, and setting default to null actually lessens the burden of maintenance. Yeah.
Why would you set a default of null versus just not setting a default at all?
If you don't set a default at all, it actually triggers you to input something. Yep.
Right, okay, so you're forcing the end user to provide input
Yep.
in that case.
If it's an optional argument, then I set the default value to null. Yeah. And if I think it's a required input argument, I don't specify anything, and it prompts them to supply a value.
Okay, that makes sense. So we have our input variables, and one of the other things that's closely tied to input variables is local values. I have opinions on where local values should reside, but Bruno, why don't you tell me where and how do you place local values inside of a module?
Sure, yeah. So I really like the concept of strong cohesion in Terraform files, meaning that anything that I deploy should live together.
Okay.
Previously, I used to split out all my infrastructure, so you'd have an ec2.tf and an iem.tf and a dns.tf, and even though I was deploying 2 or 3 applications, all my infrastructure was scattered all over those files, and locals would live in a locals.tf.
Okay.
At some point, I started to change that a little bit up, and I now have, for example, application_x.tf, and the load balancer lives in there, the EC2 instances live in there, and the DNS entries, for instance, live in there. Now, the local values, you don't have to. I think a common misconception is that folks only think that they can declare a locals block only one time. You can actually have local blocks multiple times. So what I like to do is that the local values are declared on the top of the Terraform file.
Okay.
That's where I'm using them. It's and any local that is generic or that's used throughout all the different Terraform files, I specify in a locals.tf.
Okay, so you're actually placing the multiple locals blocks across different files, but you still have somewhere to put sort of the global locals, if you could call it that.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Drew, how do you feel about that approach?
I'm pretty similar. So shared should go in a shared location. If they're shared across multiple files, ones that are isolated to a single file goes at the top. And then sometimes I'll even get creative and like if I have a single local that's only going to be used for one resource, I might put it immediately above it. Because in that circumstance, the only time that you're ever going to look and reference it is when you're looking at that individual resource.
Okay. All right, so I think we're good on input variables and locals, which brings us to the actual resources and data sources that are usually the point of a module. I know there's like the labels module that only just creates strings, but aside from that one, you're usually trying to create resources. You can make resource creation optional, and you can also create multiples. And I feel like that's a point of contention for you, Bruno, on the use of count and for each inside of a module. So why don't you explain a little bit about how you feel about those meta arguments?
Yeah, nice one. This is where I get very opinionated. So to me, looping constructs are a necessary evil. As much as I think they're sometimes nice to have, they usually bite me back. So I live by 2 sayings: count on it only when you must, where I try to say only use a count when you really need to.
Okay.
And I think the only time when I really need to use a count is when I run into a modeling problem, which is when I want to deploy a conditional resource.
Okay.
For instance, I only want to have this resource on def or on prod. I'll use a count combined with a ternary operator. But I still somehow think it seems like a modeling problem, and I always try to optimize for not having to have the count there. So then I'll think, should I move this resource outside this root module or child module? And then with for eaches, I have a saying that I live by, which is for each resource a different one. And I always try to optimize for the least amount of for eaches that are declared in my Terraform configuration. Because anytime I create a resource with a for each on it, and I have to reference it somewhere else, that ends up with a looping construct as well, because then they're being referenced. So if I have 4 identical resources that I need to deploy, I would actually declare them separately.
So the same resource block 4
Yep.
times, one
Yep.
for each thing.
So that way I avoid any time where I reference that resource, that another resource also ends up with a loop. And I typically don't deploy 100 or 200 things or n of something. So I don't typically run into the situation where I deploy the same resource 200 times. So I can get away with declaring those resources separately. And sometimes, like I said, looping constructs are a necessary evil. So I'll actually end up, like in Google Cloud, you have to enable APIs first before you can use them. So
I know.
Yeah. So there I would use a for each. I just loop over a set of APIs and I enable them. So.
Drew, what's your feeling on it? Because I don't know if I entirely agree with Bruno.
So here we do differ a little bit. Where we agree is on count. Count is basically used as a Boolean for me. You either have 1 or 0. Other than that, I hardly ever use count. But I really do like the for each construct for resources. And I think part of it may even have to go back to what I was saying about complicated variable structures. So for example, I have a VPC module where the subnets are defined in a map, and you can use any key you want. And the nice part about when you design a variable that way is now I have a map that's n in length or however many keys. And then I can use that to define the for each loop. And now each subnet, as it comes up, gets as the name label actually what I used as that key.
Right.
So you can actually get kind of, I think you can actually make your outputs look very clean when you start doing things that way because your resources actually have name labels on them too.
Interesting. So 2 different approaches to the problem.
Yeah.
And I can see pluses and minuses to both because I have run into that scenario where I'm creating 5 of this VM, which means I need 5 of a network interface for that VM, and I'm going to have to use a for each loop for both. If I know exactly how many I'm going to need, then not using the iteration might actually be easier. But if I'm leaving it up to the consumer of the module, then I might use the more complicated input variable.
It may also come down to the whole private versus public thing too, right? If you're writing modules that are privately used, then you're a lot more likely to know the scope. And if something's public, then you're generally writing a more flexible module. So it might have to do with something like that too.
And to add to that, I used to optimize really for dry code. So I used to be someone that declared for eaches everywhere, and I was optimizing for least amount of lines in my Terraform code and seeing how sophisticated and fancy I could make it. Until I realized that it always bites me back in terms of maintainability and usability and readability. So that's when I started to optimize for the more declarative approach, like least amount of for eaches. Yeah.
Right. And I do want to get into module testing in a moment, but there's one last important thing that modules have that we should probably address, and that's outputs. So, Drew, when you're thinking about designing the outputs that your module emits, what's your thought process and what's your preferred structure for outputs?
Yeah, so a little bit of a hot take here. I decided early when I was starting to design modules, I decided early that I never wanted to receive an issue from a user that was like, can you please output this attribute from a resource? I just never wanted to see that. So my strategy has been to output resources and to do it in such a way so that if you're doing like a looping construct or something like that, you can actually use Terraform to output the group. And then you can use those name labels, like what I was mentioning, so that users can actually key on and get the specific values that they want. It does add a little bit of a burden on the users, though, because it can be a little bit more complicated. And so what I try to do is include good examples on how you can actually use the outputs of the module.
So you output the entire object, the whole resource, with all the attributes and the nested blocks. And okay, I see. Interesting. Oh.
You say interesting.
Yeah, it's not something I do, because I think if you do that, you need to be very consistent. I guess then all the modules that you publish internally would have that way of outputting things, because to a user it might be a little bit confusing otherwise. But I can see where it helps, because at the end we build modules as like building blocks, and we try to offer a certain abstraction. And if they want to, the intent is that they build on top of it. We don't want to, personally, I don't want to force my company or teams to use modules everywhere. So yeah, I think it would be nice that you then output the resources. I always try to output all the attributes, and I sometimes run into issues where someone says, hey, I really need this value. You haven't outputted it. Can you create an output for it? I like the idea. Nice.
think part of that discovery discussion that you have at the beginning could help alleviate that issue. If you can identify the outputs that they're expecting to get from the module, then you can have more succinct outputs that are easier for the end user to consume. And then you could expose the entire resource as a different output if you think that's going to be helpful to them. So you have both options.
Do you do this in those public modules as well?
Yeah, both.
Okay, check.
I would be concerned about a really complicated resource, say something like an AKS cluster that has 1 million attributes. Dropping that as an output and leaving it up to the end user to parse is putting some work back on them, whereas you might want to be a little more prescriptive about exactly what you're exposing, because a lot of those attributes are never going to be relevant to the end user. But I see your point. All right, so let's move to day 2. You've published a module. You're starting to get feedback. You need to update the module. How do you deal with breaking changes?
We break software all the time, right? Yeah, I think that's all about communication. It's perfectly fine to break software. I think every project, software that doesn't break in terms of a breaking change is a little bit weird. Like I said, it's all about communication. I think an industry-wide standard is using a SEMVer, semantic versioning specification, to communicate breaking changes or enhancements or bug fixes. So if you use SEMVer, which I would highly recommend, bump a version and communicate it to your users. And make sure from a user perspective, so the module users pin their module version, so they are pinned to a particular version of that module, and they don't pull in the latest breaking change. And from a module author perspective, it's communication, bumping a version, and providing some guidance on how to deal with breaking changes. I think the AWS and Google provider are an excellent way of providing both backward and forward compatibility and providing those guides how to upgrade from V4 to V5.
Drew, when you're making a change that's not a breaking change, say an enhancement, do you bump the minor version? Is that a patch version? How do you think about that?
So patches are typically bug fixes or minor, or not literally minor, but something like a doc fix or something like that. Minor versions for me are any new feature that you're adding.
Okay.
A new resource or anything like that, as long as it doesn't break.
Can I ask a question as well?
I suppose.
So what do you bump if you bump so you have a module and that depends on a provider, like the random provider, and the random provider now gets an upgrade as well. What do you bump? Is it a minor or a patch?
Yeah, so typically I consider, unless I'm bumping a provider a major version, I consider upgrading providers a part of like a minor version.
Okay, yeah.
Right. And just to clarify for those who aren't as familiar, the provider's inherited by the root module that invokes the child module. So they might want to use a slightly different version than you tested the module with. When you're setting the required providers settings for the child module, do you typically pin it to a major version and just let it be whatever minor version?
I tend to prefer to upgrade them when necessary. So,
Okay.
If I'm making a structural change, like for example, when the S3 bucket changed a big time from 3 to 4, right? Like, if you're adjusting your module that way, that's a breaking change in your module for no doubt. But like, otherwise, I typically won't update the provider unless there's a new feature that directly impacts a resource that I'm using.
I bump providers all the time, actually. Because it's super easy to bump from 1.1.1 to 1.1.2. I just keep doing that on a regular basis using the Penabot or whatever. I've noticed that it is super hard to bump major versions. So if a module is on 2.0.0 of a provider, like the AWS provider, and they haven't updated it on a weekly basis or monthly basis to keep up with the provider, migrating from V2 to V4 is one heck of a job.
Yeah. A lot of things changed, especially in the AWS provider in that time. Maybe some breaking changes. That may have bit me once.
We're a bit guilty of that.
So when you are bumping the provider or making other changes in the module, you probably want to test that. Bruno, what is your preferred way of testing modules?
Nice. As I said earlier, I always think of building modules internally and providing them to different users you're building a little product.
Yeah.
And what goes unnoticed, or I think it's a very underrated thought, is that as a platform engineering team that provides modules to the entire business, or to all different teams in a company, you're indirectly responsible for all those workloads running on your module. And a lot of people don't think about it that way, but if the module breaks and it causes an outage, they'll actually come to you and say, hey, something weird happened with the module.
Right.
But back to testing, because I treat it like a product, I test it from a few different perspectives. So I test the unit of work. Is what this module is intending to do working? So I'll deploy it to a temporary sandbox account where we had some CI/CD set up that if we made a change or we merged it, part of the merge check would be to deploy it, run a couple tests using Terraform test. Terraform test is really good at deploying a set of resources and actually running the checks and then tearing it down. Mm-hmm. Then I also like to test for breaking changes. The input arguments that I have, is there any breaking changes in that interface? The interface of the module. The interface are the input arguments and the outputs, the attributes. I do that with Terraform test as well. And I really like to use input argument validation. Oh.
So this just occurred to me, and I want to get your take on it. If you add a new input variable to a module, and it's a required one, do you consider that a breaking change?
Yes, yeah, because it prompts for a diff. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, if they bump the provider version and pull my latest required input argument, it will produce a diff, and I consider it a breaking change. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, because it doesn't seem like a breaking change. You're not creating a new resource or altering an existing one, but the person who's consuming the module is now going to get an error because they haven't provided a value for that argument.
It's the same, it would be a breaking change from a provider perspective as well. Say you have the S3 resource and they suddenly add an attribute that you must now set as well. It would be a breaking change there as well.
Yeah. So to come back to the testing question, Drew, what about you? What's your preferred process for testing your modules?
So I'm a big fan of Terraform test. For a long time, we used TerraTest, and I think TerraTest is really great for what it can do. But it has this burden of being written in a language that not a lot of people know if they're just coming to use a Terraform module. So it's hard to expect your users to run those.
Right.
The one thing that I'd add into testing is that I think, so when you structure your modules, you typically will see the module code, you'll see examples, you might see a docs directory or something like that. But examples are one of the first thing that people click into. Like if you look at GitHub views, like my example directories are where a lot of people spend a lot of their time. And so I always try to make sure that we have tests that are testing the example repos.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
To me, that's basically you've defined the major use cases that your module is trying to achieve. And so writing tests that use those, you're validating that the use cases you intend work. And you're also validating that the documentation that you're offering and the form of example is still valid.
Right, so it serves that dual purpose of I have these examples which are supposed to be guidance on how people are using the module. If I make a change to the module and those examples don't work anymore, that's a problem. But also I get to test the intention of the module by leveraging those examples. And that's pretty easy to do with the test framework, right?
Yep. Yeah. I really like the idea of testing the examples. I think that's great. Yeah.
Yeah, and to your point, it's actually very low overhead. You just define the test and you point to the source. It's pretty straightforward.
Same for provider development. I recently ran a workshop on building Terraform providers, and someone asked the examples that the provider provides, can we automatically test those? So that triggered my thought. It's nice to do that for modules as well. Yeah.
One of my things that I really care about is documentation. What do you think of when it comes to well-structured documentation for a module? What needs to be there, and what would you like to see there, Bruno?
So I always try to think of, can you imagine using Terraform without documentation? That would be absolute pain.
I cannot.
I really like, so kudos to the team that built Terraform docs. I use it a lot. It's a tool that you can use to generate the documentation for your module.
When you say Terraform docs, you're not talking about the documentation on the HashiCorp website. You're talking about the tool that is called Terraform docs. Okay.
Exactly. Open source tool on GitHub called Terraform docs that you can use to generate module documentation with. If you're building providers, it's TF plugin docs. And that actually looks at your module, it looks at the Terraform configuration, and it documents the input arguments and the outputs, and whether there's a default value, the description, if something is required or not. Yep.
So that implies that you've written good descriptions for your inputs and your outputs, correct?
You should, yes. Yeah.
might be helpful.
I would likely not approve a PR if input argument isn't documented. Same for an output value. Yep.
When you're organizing the inputs and the outputs, alphabetical order, group them by function.
Good one. Well, required ones on the top and optional on the bottom, and I try to put things together that belong together. Yeah.
I have a feeling
I think TF docs organizes them for you, doesn't it? It sorts for you. So in the variables at TF, yeah, you can organize it that way. Okay. So one other thing that I like to add in is I think everybody loves pictures, right? Like pictures can convey so much more than paragraphs of explanation. So I try to make sure that I include, some good descriptive information on what's being built, what users should expect, what the major, decision points are for them, and then I try to include diagrams that would show different types of uses. You can also put those diagrams in your examples repo too.
So diagram like it's a load balancer with an EC2, so you provide a diagram with the load balancer in EC2. So you see it's a visualization of what you're deploying?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, cool, nice.
That is very helpful because sometimes you look at the module naming and you think you know what's in there, but having that picture, it lines up better. Okay, yes, this is the module for me.
Then again, if you need a visualization to understand what a module does, I think that's also quite painful. But I think it's a nice addition. Yeah,
I think you just threw some shade on.
Wow.
Ouch. I like a good picture. It's okay.
Okay.
When should you not write a module?
Oh, there's a lot of times you don't need to write a module. I'm strongly against the idea of pushing and forcing everyone in your company to use modules. I think a lot of folks use it to force like security standards and compliance standards. You don't force security and compliance standards using modules. You force them with organizational policies and everything that's in AWS or in Google Cloud to prevent someone from deploying a S3 bucket that is public access on. I think it's great to provide modules if they solve a particular problem. I really think that a module should do one thing and it should do it good. I'm not a big fan of a module that exposes all the possible inputs and exposes all the possible outputs because you have then created a wrapper module and I could have just used provider level resources. So if there's a good use case for it, I'll provide a module if it offers a certain abstraction to a team. And sometimes I build the same type of modules, but for different teams. So some teams, not everyone needs the same level of abstraction. A data scientist team needs a very different level of abstraction to a workload team that completely runs everything on EKS, and I'll give them a different EKS module than the ones I would give to the data scientists. Yeah, sure.
One thing I might add is don't write modules that do everything.
Yeah, the wrapper.
So we're writing them to inject opinions and to help users to deploy, complicated structures in a simple way. So make sure that you have tightly scoped modules.
Scope creep is a real thing.
Amen.
I've certainly encountered it myself. Well, this has been fascinating. I've learned a little bit. Hopefully the audience has learned a little bit. I'd like to take a moment to thank you, Bruno, and you, Drew, for agreeing to be on this panel and doing all the work so I can just sit here and enjoy it. I want to let the audience know that we are going to be hosting a Q&A session tomorrow as part of the hallway track. So I'm sure some of you have additional questions you'd like to ask these fine gentlemen. So if you do, please come up to the hallway track tomorrow at 3:30. I think it's the last hallway track. Why are we always last? Are they trying to tell me something?
Best for last.
Yes, I like that. We're saved the best for last. So please join us tomorrow at 3:30 to do some Q&A. We're also available after this talk if you have questions. Like I said, I'm Ned Bellavance.
Bruno Schaatsbergen. I go by B Schaatsbergen on socials.
Drew Mullen. I go by Drew Mullen on GitHub.
Absolutely fantastic. Thank you again, and thank you everybody for joining us. Have a great evening.